Bro, it's got hands. What the hell is that? Oh my god, oh my...
A wounded Bigfoot came to my farm in northern Montana, and what he did that night changed our family forever. By the time I understood why it had crossed miles of ranch land and gunfire to reach my farm, I was hopelessly fighting to protect my family, who had lied to me for years without me realizing. My name is Jack Conrad, and I run a cattle farm in northern Montana with my wife, Eliza. The property covers 200 acres of pasture, timber, and rocky ground that turns mean in winter. My family built the house and barns, and I spent years keeping them standing. Eliza and I raised 3 children there: Clay, our oldest, Sadie, and Rook, our youngest. The nearest neighbor lived 20 minutes away, and the closest town was small enough that everyone recognized each family's truck. Years before Rook was born, Eliza disappeared for nearly 3 weeks. Clay and Sadie were still young, and I stayed with them while search crews worked the back roads and mountain trails north of town. Eliza had gone alone to check a relative's empty cabin before winter closed the route. Her truck was found near a washed-out road, but she eventually walked out of the timber miles from where the search had focused. She was exhausted, badly dehydrated, and carrying an injury along her ribs that later left a long scar. Eliza said she had fallen during the storm, lost her bearings, and survived by finding shelter wherever she could. That was the version everyone accepted. She never liked discussing those weeks, and I never pushed her for more than she was willing to give. She had returned alive, and with 2 children waiting at home, that mattered more than filling every gap in her story. The strange reports from the mountains faded soon after she came back. For years, I treated that timing as coincidence. Then cattle started disappearing again. The first new incident happened on a ranch a few miles east of us. A calf vanished overnight, and part of the fence had been crushed inward hard enough to split 2 posts. I heard about it at the feed store and joined the search. We found blood near the break, but the trail stopped at rocky ground, less than 100 yards away. There were no clear tracks, drag marks, or hides caught on the wire. A bear was the obvious answer, but the damage did not fit. The calf turned up above the creek, wedged between 2 fallen trees, high enough that several men had to climb to reach it. Hardly any of the carcass had been eaten, and no clear trail led to it. Before anyone settled on an explanation, another rancher farther north reported that part of his barn door had been torn away during the night. The animals inside had crowded into the farthest corner of their stalls. The mood at the feed store changed after that. Older men began bringing up the incidents from years earlier: the broken fencing, the strange calls, and the livestock moved in ways ordinary predators could not manage. By lunchtime, the same words were moving through town. Bigfoot was back. The older stories came back with it. During the same weeks Eliza was missing, people had reported heavy movement along mountain roads, calls carrying through the timber after dark, and livestock found outside locked enclosures. One barn had been damaged so badly that the owner replaced the entire front wall. Search crews heard some of those stories while looking for Eliza, but nobody treated them as connected. Once she returned and the incident stopped, most people let the subject disappear with them. I had heard pieces of it over the years, usually in quiet conversations that ended whenever someone unfamiliar entered the room. Eliza never joined those conversations. Whenever anyone mentioned that earlier period, she found a reason to leave or change the subject. Now the Bigfoot reports had started again, and each new sighting placed it farther south than the last. A fence was found bent outward on a property north of town. 2 nights later, something tore loose part of a shed door several miles farther south. One rancher claimed he saw a tall shape cross the road ahead of his truck before disappearing into the trees. Eliza remembered every location. At home, I found her studying an old county map at the kitchen table with several places marked in pencil. She said she only wanted to know how close Bigfoot had come to our farm. That made sense with 3 kids and livestock spread across 200 acres, so I did not question it. The first incident sat far to the north. Each new one appeared closer to us, almost as though Bigfoot had chosen a direction and kept following it. Eliza folded the map as soon as she realized I was standing behind her, then tucked it into a drawer beneath the phone. That evening, something forced its way into a barn less than 10 miles from our property. The barn belonged to a rancher who kept a few horses and a small cattle herd. He woke to the animals kicking against their stalls hard enough to shake the walls. One horse broke through its gate before he reached it, knocked him into a post and kept running until it hit the far fence. I drove over the next morning to help with repairs. The stall door was split near the hinges, but the marks outside bothered me more. Deep cuts crossed the wall above my head, far beyond anything the horse could have made. Part of the frame had been forced inward, yet the cattle were untouched and the feed bins remained closed. Near the back corner, I found a strip of heavy cable tangled around a broken post. It was thick enough to hold something much larger than a bear, and it was covered in fresh blood. The rancher wanted the cable cleared out with the rest of the broken fencing, so I took the twisted section home and laid it across the workbench. It was heavier than anything we used for cattle, braided steel with one end warped where something had pulled hard enough to deform the metal. Dark hair clung to the blood near the break. Clay thought it might belong to a logging crew. I knew better. There were no active sites near that ranch, and the cable had been shaped into a loop. Someone had built a snare. If the Bigfoot reports were true, someone had already trapped the creature and failed to hold it. Eliza was worried enough already, so I carried the cable outside before she came into the barn. She was standing near the porch with Rook beside her when a low call rolled across the pasture. Rook lifted his head toward the sound. Eliza reacted first, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him close. 2 nights later, Clay came with me to check the cattle along the north pasture. The wind pushed clouds over the moon, making the tree line disappear every few seconds. We were halfway along the fence when Clay's horse started pulling against the reins. At first, I thought it had caught the scent of a predator. Then something moved inside the timber beside us. It kept pace without showing itself. Every time the horses slowed, the footsteps slowed too. When we moved faster, branches snapped farther ahead, as though whatever was in there already knew where we were going. Clay's horse finally reared, threw him into the grass, and took off with one boot still caught in the stirrup. I reached him before the horse dragged him beneath the fence. I grabbed Clay under the arms and pulled while the animal kicked inches from his head. His boot finally slipped free, and the horse tore away toward the barn. Then the movement in the trees stopped. Clay was hurt but conscious. I got him upright and started leading my horse back while he leaned against me. I still had not seen enough to swear a Bigfoot was following us, but I could no longer pretend a bear explained everything happening around our property. Something followed us the entire way home. I returned to the north pasture after sunrise, once Clay was inside, with ice wrapped around his ankle. Farther along the tree line, I found one impression pressed deep into the mud. It was too blurred to call a footprint, though it was longer than my boot and wide across the front. There should have been more. I found broken branches, flattened grass, and blood on the bark, but no clear trail leading in or out. Whatever had followed us seemed to have stepped into that spot and disappeared. I crouched beside the impression and took out my phone. Rain started before I could get a useful picture. The edges softened and water filled the deepest part. Within minutes, there was nothing left but a shallow hole in the ground. Then something cracked deeper in the timber, much closer than it had been the night before. Rook started sleeping badly after that. I heard him moving around downstairs after the rest of us had gone to bed, never loud enough to wake the house, just slow footsteps across the kitchen and the occasional creak near the back door. More than once, I found him standing at the window over the sink, staring toward the north pasture. He never seemed frightened, which bothered me, more than if he had been. I figured the Bigfoot stories had gotten into his head, especially after Clay came home hurt. Eliza began checking on him before bed, keeping the curtains closed after dark, and refusing to let him handle chores near the northern fence alone. Her own behavior changed along with his. I woke one morning to find her sitting upright beside me, with a hand pressed against the scar along her ribs, listening toward the window. The scar kept troubling her as the Bigfoot reports moved closer. She ate less, slept poorly, and reacted to low calls from the timber before the dogs did. She brought up leaving the farm that evening. She wanted to take the children to her sister's place near Bozeman until the Bigfoot moved on. I reminded her that winter was closing in, the cattle needed us, and we could not abandon the farm every time something dangerous crossed the county. Eliza dropped the subject, but another Bigfoot call rolled out of the timber after dark. She was out of bed before the dogs raised their heads. But Bigfoot coming to my farm is just the beginning of what the Sasquatch is truly capable of. If you want to find out the real truth behind his existence, you can read my ebook at the top of the description of this video. Watch out though, because the reality will change your perspective forever after you've read this. Now, back to my farm. I followed her downstairs and found her gripping the kitchen counter, listening toward the northern pasture. When we returned to bed, she remained restless. At some point, a low sound rose from her throat, slower and quieter than the Bigfoot calls outside. It stopped the moment I touched her shoulder. She blamed it on a bad dream when morning came. I wanted to believe her. Before that same week was over, Sadie woke the house after finding the back door open and Rook missing from his bed. I found Rook beyond the yard stood near the northern fence, barefoot in the cold with nothing over his pajamas. He stood facing the timber, completely still, while Sadie stayed near the porch and called for him. Eliza reached him before I did, wrapped both arms around him, and pulled him away from the fence. A Bigfoot call answered from deep in the trees. This one came from close enough to carry through the wind without fading. The dogs rushed from beneath the porch and barked toward the same section of timber. Something heavy moved through the brush, stopped, then shifted farther south along the edge of our property. Rook turned toward it again. Eliza tightened her grip and hurried him back to the house while I followed with the rifle raised. Nobody returned to bed. Clay checked the doors despite his injured ankle. Sadie stayed beside Rook, and Eliza watched the northern pasture without moving from the window. The weather worsened before the hour was over. Wind drove sleet against the house, and the power failed hard enough to shut down every light at once. I had barely started toward the generator when the cattle began pressing against the southern fence, desperate to put distance between themselves and the barn. Gunfire broke somewhere beyond our property. Several shots came in quick succession, followed by a Bigfoot roar that rolled across the pasture. More shots answered from farther east. Whatever was happening in the timber was moving toward us. I reached the front window as a huge shape broke from the trees. It ran unevenly, favoring one leg, with blood darkening its shoulder and side. Broken cable dragged behind it, snapping against the frozen ground. The wounded Bigfoot crossed the pasture without slowing. It was heading straight for our outer gate. I stepped onto the porch with the rifle braced against my shoulder and fired into the ground several yards ahead of the gate. The shot cracked across the pasture, but the wounded Bigfoot barely reacted. It slowed for half a second, lowered its head, and kept coming. Up close, the injuries were worse than they had looked from the house. Blood covered one side of its body, and a length of broken cable was still looped tightly around its lower leg, cutting into the flesh each time it moved. Even so, it hit the gate with enough force to shake the posts. The first impact bent the center rail. The second pulled one hinge partly out of the concrete. I fired again and hit it high in the shoulder. The Bigfoot twisted from the shot, then grabbed the gate with both hands and tore it sideways. Metal shrieked as the hinge ripped free. It dragged the entire section loose, lifted it, and threw it into my truck. The gate crushed the hood and shattered the windshield. Our quickest way off the property was gone before any of us reached the keys. Clay pulled Sadie and Rook farther inside, while Eliza stayed near the doorway, watching the Bigfoot instead of the ruined truck. The creature crouched behind the fallen gate when I raised the rifle again, using the metal between us like it understood exactly what the weapon could do. Then it abandoned the road and moved toward the barn. It passed within reach of the cattle without touching them, forced open the side entrance, and disappeared into the dark. A moment later, the Bigfoot called from inside the barn. It was searching for someone. I moved toward the barn with the rifle ready while Clay stayed near the house with Sadie and Rook. Eliza followed several steps behind me, even after I told her to stay inside. The cattle had crowded against the far wall, leaving the center aisle open. Somewhere above us, boards creaked under the Bigfoot's weight. It moved through the loft first, knocking aside hay bales and tearing open the storage room at the back. When it found nothing there, it dropped into the aisle hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. I expected it to attack the livestock. Instead, it passed within a few feet of them without turning its head. It opened empty stalls, pulled apart a stack of feed sacks, and shoved its way into the small room where we kept winter clothing and old blankets. Then it called again. The sound carried through the barn and toward the house. Eliza stopped behind me. Her attention went to the windows, not the creature, and she told me the Bigfoot was not looking for food or shelter. It moved into the equipment shed next, forcing the connecting door from its track. Tools hit the floor as it searched behind shelves and overturned an empty grain bin. Every few seconds, it called toward the house and waited. I finally understood that it expected someone to answer. The Bigfoot came back into the aisle and turned toward Eliza. Blood ran down its side, but its posture changed the moment it saw her standing behind me. Eliza stepped backward. The creature moved toward us. I raised the rifle, and Eliza grabbed the barrel before I could fire. Eliza pulled the rifle aside just as the Bigfoot lunged. The shot struck a beam above the aisle, sending splinters down across the stalls. I shoved her behind me and tried to bring the weapon back up, but the creature reached us before I could aim again. One arm swept across my chest and threw me into the side of an empty stall. The impact drove the air out of me and left my shoulder burning. Eliza backed toward the barn doors while Bigfoot followed, one hand reaching for her and the other dragging against the wall to keep its injured leg beneath it. She was frightened. I could see it in the way she kept moving away and holding both hands between them. Whatever she knew about the creature, she did not trust it enough to let it touch her. I forced myself upright and caught the rifle from the floor. The Bigfoot turned the moment it heard the metal scrape against the boards. Its attention shifted from Eliza to me, and the low sound in its chest deepened. Clay appeared near the barn entrance carrying a splitting maul. He had ignored my order to remain with the others and limped into the aisle before I could stop him. Bigfoot rushed him. Clay swung once. The creature caught the handle, snapped it near the head, and struck him across the shoulder. He hit the barn doors and collapsed against the frame. I fired at close range. The bullet tore across Bigfoot's ribs, but it kept moving and caught me by the throat. Eliza stepped between us and made the same low sound I had heard her produce in her sleep. Bigfoot released me immediately. Bigfoot backed away from Eliza, but only far enough to give us room. It stayed between her and the barn doors, breathing hard, blood running down its side and onto the boards. Clay was trying to push himself upright near the entrance, and I could hear Sadie calling from the house. I knew we could not keep fighting it in the open aisle. The cattle chute sat beyond the equipment shed, built from heavy rails and sliding gates strong enough to hold a full-grown bull. If I could draw Bigfoot inside and close both ends, we might contain it long enough to get everyone away from the farm. I moved toward the connecting door and struck the metal rail with the rifle stock. The sound pulled its attention from Eliza. I backed into the handling lane, making sure it followed, then slipped through the narrow side opening before Clay dropped the first gate behind it. Bigfoot realized what we had done almost immediately. It threw itself against the rails, bending one section outward with the first impact. I climbed onto the tractor and lowered the bucket against the opening while Clay dragged a chain through the damaged gate. For several seconds, the trap held. Then Bigfoot caught the chain and ripped it from Clay's hands. He fell backward as the gate tore loose from its track. The creature reached through the opening, grabbed the tractor frame, and pulled hard enough to lift one side off the ground. The cab tipped toward the chute. Glass broke around me, and the steering column drove into my ribs. I tried to crawl out, but Bigfoot tore another rail free and pinned part of the cab against my leg. Eliza ran into the lane before Clay could stop her. Bigfoot turned toward her, leaving me trapped beneath the machine. Eliza moved toward Bigfoot with both hands raised, using the same low sound that had stopped it inside the barn. Bigfoot hesitated, breathing hard, one hand still wrapped around the broken rail. Its attention stayed on her long enough for Clay to reach the tractor and pull at the twisted door. The cab shifted just enough for me to drag my leg free. Pain shot through my knee when I tried to stand, but I managed to crawl clear before Bigfoot shoved the tractor away from the chute. The machine rolled onto its side and crushed part of the outer fence. Eliza kept herself between us. Bigfoot reached for her again, slower this time, but she stepped back. She looked frightened enough that I raised the rifle despite everything that had already happened. Headlights swept across the pasture before I could fire. Several trucks came through the ruined entrance, engines pushing hard against the storm. Neighbors had heard the gunfire and followed it to our farm. Men climbed out with hunting rifles, shotguns, and flashlights, spreading across the yard before any of us could explain what they were walking into. Bigfoot reacted the moment the lights hit it. It tore the last rail from the chute and charged toward the nearest truck. Gunfire opened from 3 directions. Bullets struck the barn, the tractor, and the frozen ground around us. One round hit Bigfoot across the back. Another shattered the fence beside Sadie as she ran from the porch toward Clay. She dropped into the mud, covering her head, while wood fragments scattered over her coat. I threw myself between her and the shooters. Bigfoot turned at the same moment, roaring toward the men who had nearly hit her. Rook remained just inside the doorway where Eliza had ordered him to stay. Sadie threw herself behind the water trough while wood fragments scattered across the yard. I moved between her and the shooters. Bigfoot turned at the same moment, roaring toward the men who had nearly hit her. Then a low sound came from the house behind us. Rook had answered him. Bigfoot stopped in the middle of its charge. The armed men kept shouting and repositioning around the trucks, but Bigfoot no longer watched them. Its head turned toward the house, following the low sound that had come from inside. Rook stepped through the doorway before Eliza could reach him. He moved slowly across the porch, still wearing only his socks, his attention fixed on Bigfoot. When he made the sound again, Bigfoot lowered its shoulders and answered in the same rough pattern. The change in Bigfoot was immediate. The rage that had carried it through the gunfire gave way to a guarded stillness. It moved toward Rook despite the wounds in its leg, shoulder, and side, stopping whenever one of the rifles shifted. I tried to push Rook back toward the house, but he pulled away from me with more force than I expected. Eliza reached him next and stood between him and the yard, though she kept looking from Rook to Bigfoot as if she already understood what the rest of us were only beginning to see. Under the truck lights, details that had never meant much on their own became harder to ignore. Rook and Bigfoot tilted their heads the same way when listening, and the sounds coming from their throats followed the same rhythm. When Bigfoot reached the edge of the yard, Rook lifted one hand toward it. Bigfoot raised its own hand in exactly the same way. The neighbors noticed too. One of the older men looked from Rook to Eliza, then began working through the dates aloud. Eliza's disappearance had happened before Rook was born. The old Bigfoot activity had stopped when she returned. Now Bigfoot had crossed miles of ranch land and gunfire to reach our farm. The men who had known Rook his entire life began backing away from him. Then one of them raised his rifle and aimed it at my son. I moved in front of Rook before the man could settle his aim. He shouted for me to step aside, but I stayed where I was. Whatever truth had just come into the open, Rook was still my son, and nobody was going to put a bullet through him while I could stand. Eliza pulled Rook behind her as another rifle turned in their direction. Bigfoot saw the movement and charged across the yard, placing its wounded body between Rook and the trucks. A shot struck it high in the back. Bigfoot staggered, caught itself against the broken fence, then tore the rifle from the nearest man's hands and threw him across the hood of a truck. The yard broke into chaos again. Some of the neighbors kept firing while others shouted for them to stop. These were men who had watched Rook grow up, but fear had changed the way they looked at him. One tried to circle behind Eliza with a length of rope, convinced Rook had to be restrained before he became as dangerous as the creature protecting him. Clay reached the man first and knocked him away from Rook. Sadie stayed behind the water trough, calling for everyone to stop before another stray round found one of us. I fired into the frozen ground near the trucks, forcing the armed men back. Bigfoot watched the barrel for a moment, then turned its back on me and moved closer to Rook. A neighbor rushed from behind the truck and grabbed Rook around the chest. Rook twisted free with enough force to send the man crashing into the side panel. That was all the others needed to see. Several rifles came up at once. The first shot struck the ground beside Rook's feet. Bigfoot swept him behind its legs and charged before the men could fire again. It hit the nearest truck hard enough to rock it onto two wheels, then ripped the driver's door open and used it as a shield. Bullets hammered the metal while Bigfoot forced the shooters backward across the yard. Eliza pulled Rook toward the barn, but two men cut them off near the broken chute. Clay drove into one of them from the side. I caught the other across the shoulder with the rifle stock before he could raise his shotgun. Sadie came out from behind the trough and dragged Clay away as another round struck the fence where his head had been. The men were firing too wildly to care who stood behind their target. One bullet punched through the barn wall. Another shattered the kitchen window. Bigfoot reached Eliza and Rook before the shooters could close around them. It crouched over both of them, taking another hit across the ribs. Blood ran through the hair along its side, but it stayed upright. I stepped beside it. Clay joined me with a broken length of fence rail. Sadie moved behind us, keeping Rook low while Eliza pressed both hands against Bigfoot's wound. For one brief moment, my whole family stood beside Bigfoot. The neighbors hesitated. They had come expecting an animal they could surround and kill. Instead, they saw my family standing with it. One of the men lowered his rifle. Another followed. The rest did not. A truck engine roared near the gate. The driver turned the headlights toward us and accelerated across the yard, aiming straight for Bigfoot, Eliza, and Rook. Bigfoot pulled Rook from Eliza and pushed him into my arms. Then it stepped into the truck's path. The truck struck Bigfoot hard enough to throw it across the hood. It crashed beside the broken chute as the driver lost control and slammed into the overturned tractor. Rook tore from my arms and ran to Bigfoot, dropping beside its shoulder and repeating the low call. Bigfoot answered weakly. The remaining rifles lowered. Eliza reached them next and helped Bigfoot onto one knee. The way it leaned into her made the truth impossible to ignore. The neighbors began retreating, but I knew they would return with more men. Eliza took Rook inside. When she came back, she wore her winter coat and carried a packed canvas bag. Rook stood beside her with his boots on. I wanted to stop them, but the choice had already been made. Clay and Sadie still had me. Rook would not be safe here after what the neighbors had seen. Bigfoot rose with Eliza supporting it. Rook walked beneath its other arm as they crossed the northern pasture and disappeared into the trees. I found Eliza's letter on our bed. She wrote that Bigfoot had saved her during the weeks she disappeared. She had returned carrying Rook, knowing he might not be mine. Bigfoot had not come to kill us. It had come for Eliza and Rook. By sunrise, the blood trail ended at the tree line. My wife, my youngest son, and Bigfoot were gone. Eliza had left behind her clothes, her photographs, and the life we had built together. What she took with her was the part of our family I could never replace. A wounded Bigfoot came to our farm that night. By morning, nothing in our family would ever be the same.